and then tracing it, not only until that point where Darwin left off, but then going on to the history of man proper, after he became a Homo sapien and a new Paleolithic man and a Neolithic man, and then on to the advent of civilization and the advent of language. One of the valuable inputs was the work in linguistics that had been done and in cognitive sciences, which I of course availed of. And I of course availed of the work done in neurosciences, which became available after the advent of the various scans, scanning tools and techniques. So now I was looking at man in this context, not the way that philosophy or religions had in the past done, where they started with man in civilization. Both of them, philosophies and religions, started with man in civilization, which, as I said earlier, is no more than about 14 or 15 millennia. That is all. So I was looking for trying to understand not only for the origins of human dimensions, which we are observable more easily, but also for their mechanics, because nothing less than that would make us intelligent about man. If we did not understand his objective origins and their development, and then their mechanics. I also quickly realized that when I was looking at man from the standpoint of his future, it inevitably meant looking at man's mind and not at his liver or lungs. That was being sufficiently attended to by another branch of science, which had its applications in the medical profession. I was looking at man in terms of his mind. So, and in relation to the mind, it was necessary to understand his origins. Now, please bear in mind that the importance of inquiry into the origins of the mind is really a substitute inquiry for directly and objectively being able to know the constituents and the components of which his mind, the mental processes are made. Of course, it was obvious to me that that's going to be much more difficult. What I could see was that the mental processes are not biological processes. They are not made up of organic molecules, nor are they made up of simply electrons or any one of the known energy forms. For a number of reasons, which I have tried to spell out at length elsewhere, through a process of exclusion, it became clear that there had to be other forces about which we had been informed broadly by particle physics. Let me mention just in passing that at about this time, more and more particles were being discovered. particularly after the work on Einstein's theories, which went into the exploration of other particles other than the electrons, protons and neutrons, which we were familiar with earlier. You might call them weak particles or subparticles, by whatever name you call them, but they were more than 100 by now, about 120 plus, and then various forms of them. Then the discovery of strings as an even earlier form of energies was also around the corner and emerging. So there was this huge canvas opening up about energy forms other than the ones which were known and conventional. So the mental processes had a rather large area within which they could have emerged as a reality, as an objective reality. The problem was that if you insisted upon looking for mental processes in the terms that were known to us through physics in an earlier time, then I wouldn't blame you for saying that the mental processes are supernatural, but no longer. That was not available to me at a tangible level, where I could possibly come up, even in a hypothesis, in a reasonable hypothesis, with a construct about its formation, objective formation, and its actual components. I did come to the conclusion that probably it was neutrinos. There's a family of neutrinos, and possibly other mental processes don't have to be made of just one component, one specific weak energy form. It could be lots of them, a number of them. So it could be, like most other things in nature, a hybrid product made up of a number of components, but in that region, in the region of weak forces and weak particles. But that was not sufficient for my purposes. All that enabled me to do was to assert that the mental processes were a part of nature, were a product of nature. The only thing is that they were made up of components which existed before the Big Bang. And we did not have to confine or limit our inquiry to things that came to be made by nature after the Big Bang, the heavier particles or atoms or molecules. But that was not sufficient to make come up with a working hypothesis for my initial question of the origin of mental processes and their mechanics. At a sufficient level of development where they could comprise at least a basis for a working hypothesis, which means a hypothesis you can work with, you can experiment, you can set up observations on the basis of a hypothesis and then draw inferences after critically evaluating them. For that it was necessary to come up with something better. Hence I had to resort to the history of the mind and the historical origins of the mind, which took me back to the information available from molecular biology and from evolutionary sciences, coupled with Darwin's work, and then the work in history the discoveries about early man and the advent of civilization and language. So these were the tools, these were the inputs which I had to try and collect and then use them through as strict a reasoning as I could achieve, a working hypothesis concerning the mind. Because look, if I did not understand the mind as a reality, I could not possibly think of man in terms of his mind. I would again be pushed back to the situation where I would be obliged to think of man either as philosophers or prophets had thought about man in the past. In the modern times, I found that they had managed to bypass the issue. And I was here confronting that issue squarely. And that is why, that is the route I took. And that was mentology. There I realized that cellular life was not going to possibly survive given the nature of its relationship with its environment. By relationship I mean the dynamic with its environment, without computing systems, without perceptual systems, without emotive systems, without executionary systems, and without the other supporting systems required for that. All this would be, so this was going to be a whole lot of work, and which could only have arisen out of the random process which prevailed at that time in nature. Is the only process that least efficient of processes was the most efficient process available in nature at that time. It had to come up with the capability of making programs concerning perceptions, cognitions, evaluations, and a subjective scale on which to evaluate them, and then problem solving programs, and then programs, a complex emotive and computing program coupled with an emotive mechanism, which would then come up with a program for coming to conclusion, making choices, and then for executing those choices. All this would constitute the mental processes. So so that has been my journey, and my conclusions were that the emotive I don't know, I would like to call it phenomena, because it was a putting together of some of the most efficient energy forms in nature,